Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual town hall, part of an ongoing series hosted by the UCCS College of Education. My name is Tom Christensen, and I'm the provost at UCCS. While our K-12 schools have faced significant challenges as a result of COVID-19, the dedicated staff in our schools have continued to provide a supportive environment for students to learn and succeed. After our first educational community town hall in August, it was clear that we needed more discussion and information sharing to occur. The UCCS College of Education, with their commitment to partnering with Colorado Springs, El Paso County, and Southern Colorado in support of teachers, counselors, leaders, and human services professionals, stepped forward to continue the educational town hall series and to explore a series of specific topics. Today, we focus attention on a critical aspect of the pandemic, which has received less attention than some others: parents' perceptions of remote learning. I want to thank the faculty and staff in the College of Education and Valerie Martin Conley, Dean, for sponsoring this town hall on behalf of UCCS. UCCS is proud of the work that the College of Education does to provide access to educational opportunities and to improve learning outcomes through research and scholarship and innovation. It's now my pleasure to introduce the Dean of the UCCS College of Education, Valerie Martin Conley.
Thank you so much, Provost Christensen, for that warm welcome and for your support of the College of Education Town Hall series. Yes, the College of Education is committed to working collaboratively with all members of the education community, and we're committed to doing everything that we can to support all of you. We don't have all the answers, but we are here to help. Our conversation today is grounded in research conducted by two UCCS faculty members, Dr. Dick Carpenter, Professor of Leadership Research and Foundations in the College of Education, and Dr. Josh Dunn, Professor of Political Science in the College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. They are joined by two of our local partners and a parent. In the interest of time, we'll limit introductions here. However, we've put together a document including panelists' bios that you can get to by clicking the link below the video window. There's also a link to submit questions. Our panelists include Dr. Dick Carpenter, Dr. Josh Dunn, Shane Scala, Principal of Discovery High School in Whitefield District 3, Megan Olson, Principal of Mesa Elementary School in Fountain District 8, Ellen Burkart, parent of first grade student in District 20 school and director of first year experience and parent family programs in the Office for Student Support and Retention at UCCS. I'd like to give a special thanks and shout out to Doris Taglia-Latella for interpreting for us this evening. If we do run into technical difficulties, we appreciate your patience. This is a virtual event and it is being recorded. We will invite you then to come back to view the recording at your leisure if we do run into those difficulties. So let's get started. First, I'd like to give Dr. Carpenter an opportunity to share a brief overview of the research that he and Dr. Dunn have conducted. Dr. Carpenter, over to you.
Great, thank you, Dean Conley. And hello, everyone, and welcome to our town hall. We're glad that you joined us. We are going to give some top-line results from our study. It's a very long report that is available online, and I'll talk about where you can find that in just a moment. So today we'll talk about just some top-line results from the study. This is something that Dr. Dunn and I did in early August of this year. We surveyed parents using an online instrument, and we surveyed a little more than 1,700 parents all across the country. The survey included parents from public schools, traditional public schools, charter schools, and private schools as well. So if you want to read the whole report, you can actually go to the website for the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual. That's at UCCS, and you can find the entire report there. So on to some top line results. If you are a regular consumer of media, you will recall that the contemporary media in spring 2020 portrayed remote learning as chaotic and even a failure. But in our findings, we found something quite different. We expected in our survey to find something very similar to what we were hearing in the news, but that's not entirely what we found. Instead, we found, for instance, that parents reported greater than 80% of their schools created some type of remote learning. And I'll describe what some of that remote learning looked like in just a moment. Now, about 10% of parents said that their schools canceled their classes and did not offer any remote learning of any kind. So the greatest majority of parents said that their schools provided some kind of remote learning during spring 2020. And I should emphasize that our results are really about spring 2020. We don't have any data about what's going on currently. So this is backward looking at spring 2020. So of those parents who said their schools canceled classes, they didn't have any kind of program provided to them, of those, only about 28% said that they created their own learning programs. The remainder said that their children watched TV or played video games, or they worked around the house, or maybe they worked for pay. So of those parents who had nothing provided by the school, only a small, less than a third, only a small percentage actually created their own learning programs at home. So remote learning tended to be of three broad types. The first was hard copy materials were sent from the school to the home. The second was videos or software were recommended or sometimes provided by the school to the home. And the third was live classes provided online. And schools really provided kind of a mixture of these things, because when schools started closing in March, it was very common that hard copy materials were sent home quickly, and then online programming was created after that. The structure of online learning, according to parents, varied from completely unstructured with some communication between the school and the parent, to highly structured programs with daily assignments and frequent contact. Overall, most parents reported they had somewhat of a structured program. So not highly structured, not unstructured, kind of in between, a somewhat structured program. And that typically took the form of weekly assignments and frequent check-ins during the week between parents and teachers. As spring wore on, we began to hear stories that even though schools were offering educational programs, the expectations in these programs were not very consistent. In particular, what was not consistent was how assignments were graded, and then the use of those grades varied. So that's what we found as well. So it wasn't just media inflation. In fact, that's indeed what we found. Some families reported that assignments were regularly graded and that these grades played an important part in the overall grade for the year. And others said that the assignments were graded, but they really weren't all that important in the overall grade. And then finally, some others said that the grading wasn't occurring at all. To implement these programs, so that's kind of, in general, what we saw in spring 2020, or what parents reported as far as remote learning in spring 2020. To implement these programs, parents said that they spent about 2.5 hours a day helping with remote learning. And their children spent about 3.5 hours a day involved in remote learning. For people who are familiar with homeschooling or homeschooling research, those numbers sound pretty familiar. It's a pretty consistent finding in homeschool research that children spent about 4 hours a day involved in formal instruction when they're involved in a homeschool type setting. So that 3.5 hours a day is pretty similar. But I should stress that virtual or remote learning is not homeschooling. They're very different things. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Now, 2.5 hours a day may seem like not a lot, but most parents nonetheless describe their involvement as heavily involved on a daily basis. And to do that, parents felt on average to be somewhat prepared. We asked them, how prepared did you feel to do remote learning? We had this on a scale of 1 to 6. And on average, parents said that they felt somewhat prepared to do remote learning. We also asked parents to assess the experience. And this was one of the more surprising things. Parents were quite sanguine in the experience. I say surprisingly because the media reporting at the time in spring and even in summer 2020 portrayed parents as completely overwhelmed and dissatisfied with the entire experience. But when we asked them to rate the usefulness of the resources that were provided to them by their schools, all of the resources were rated as somewhat helpful, often helpful, and many of them were approaching very helpful. And similarly, the communications that schools had with parents was rated as effective overall. And we asked them to rate various different types of communications and method of communications, and consistently across those, they reported that the communications were very effective. The large majority of the parents said that they communicated with school on a basis of like about a few times a week. Perhaps one of the more, I would say, surprising findings from our study is what parents planned to do for the 2021 school year. That is the one that we're in right now. Remember, we gathered these data in August, early August of 2020, and we asked parents, what do you plan to do in fall 2020? Where do you plan to send your child for school? Throughout spring and summer of 2020, there were many stories about the huge number of parents that were going to homeschool. They were going to choose something other than the traditional school. Yet what we found was something very different. Most parents in the survey said that they planned to send their child to a brick and mortar school in whatever form it operated, whether the school operated in person, whether it was a hybrid, whether they were going to operate online, whatever it was, they were going to send their child to their traditional brick and mortar school. If there was a shift away from the traditional brick and mortar school, it was not going to be to homeschooling. Instead, it was going to be a designated virtual school. And by designated virtual school, what I mean is a school that operated as a virtual school prior to the COVID pandemic and schools closing in March. So that shift was not to homeschooling, it was going to be to virtual schooling. And we also found that despite all the talk about homeschool pods and private tutors, that it was a very, very small percentage of parents who said they were going to choose to homeschool in the fall. So from this, we have 3 basic takeaways from our findings. The first is that media reports in spring 2020 portrayed remote schooling as chaotic, but on the contrary, our results found that parents were generally satisfied with remote learning. Nonetheless, parents were concerned that their children may be behind academically as a result of remote learning. There's research ongoing right now all across the country, and it'll go on for years, I'm quite sure, looking to see if this remote learning episode has caused what is being called a COVID slide. So it remains to be seen if this concern bears out, but there was certainly concern in our survey results by parents that their children would be behind academically. The third major finding is that, or takeaway, is that the experience in spring 2020 suggests that large-scale change in the education system is possible, but not probable. So here's what I mean by that. When we say possible, we mean it could actually technically be possible that large numbers of parents and large numbers of families don't send their child to a traditional brick and mortar school as we normally think of it, but rather they do virtual school. The experience that we're having now, and certainly in spring 2020, suggests that is possible, but we think it is not probable. And we say it's not probable because the revealed preference of parents, when we ask them, what is it you think you're going to do in the fall, was either to send their child to a traditional brick and mortar school or to a virtual school, not to a homeschool. And I want to emphasize, a virtual school is not homeschooling. Virtual schooling is more teacher-driven than traditional homeschooling. In traditional homeschooling, the instructional programming is decided by parents. It's largely driven by parents, where in virtual schooling, it's largely driven by the school and by teachers who are involved in the instructional programming. to the extent that parents are willing to consider remote learning, it appears that they're more interested in someone else leading it rather than leading it themselves, as you might see in a traditional homeschool. Moreover, we asked why parents were going to send their child to a virtual school, or that small fraction who said they were going to homeschool. And the overwhelming majority of parents who were going to do something other than the traditional brick and mortar schools said they were concerned for their child's health. A tiny fraction said they were going to send their child, or they were going to homeschool their child, or perhaps virtual school because they thought their child would receive a better education. Instead, their primary concern was their child's health, which of course is not surprising. So all of this together, in conclusion, all of this together leads us to think that large-scale change is possible but not probable. And those who are familiar with educational reform authors, you probably heard them talk a lot during spring and summer of 2020 about how there's going to be large-scale change, educational renaissance, et cetera, et cetera. Our results suggest that's probably not likely. So those are our primary results. And I'll hand it back to you, Dean Conley, to get us going on our discussion.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for providing that overview. It really does cue up our conversation, I think, very, very well. And we've now heard from the data, and I'd like to turn now and see if we can get a little bit of perspective from parents themselves. So Ellen, if I could start with you, and then anyone else on our panel who also happens to have a child who is learning in this COVID environment, I'll invite you also to chime in and get the conversation started. So Ellen?
Thank you. By no means am I representing all parents, but I can definitely remember back to March and getting kind of this memo from UCCS that we were all going remote for work, and then also finding out that my daughter was going to be going remote for schooling and wondering what that all meant. So trying to figure that all out. How do we work full time and teach our kids and get them signed into all of these things? So we did know that we were going to have the ability to use technology and that we had to pick up some materials for her, but that was about it. And then we kind of fumbled through. We were lucky that we had spring break in there to try to get everything organized. But then it was a lot of what Dr. Carpenter said of being able to figure out the technology pieces that we were given and also the hard copies of things. And just kind of, for me, it was fumbling through. My daughter was in kindergarten at the time, and we didn't really have a schedule. She didn't get to say goodbye to any of her friends. And so I think that was really hard. There was no structured meeting times or anything like that. And so we got to the point in our experience, again, this is kindergarten, where we just felt like we weren't really progressing in the learning that we needed to. It felt like we were watching a lot of Sesame Street videos, and she was doing math that she'd been able to do for a long time. And so eventually her teacher was wonderful in the sense that we could communicate with her often and frequently, but we were not getting what we needed. And so we changed some things up. And I won't get into that right now, but we changed some things up. And then we decided for the fall to have her go in person. So she's been in person, but now is back to e-learning. But we prepped for this. We met with her teacher very early on and started making plans for if and when we're back to e-learning for a while, what would that look like? And for her first grade teacher, it's been a whole different experience. It's been very structured. We have certain times where we sign in for class. And for us, the experience has been a lot better. So we've learned through the e-learning that the structure and for her to be able to see her friends has been the key to her success so far in making this a much different experience for us than it was in the spring.
So thanks for that, Ellen. Any other parents on the call want to jump in and share a little bit?
Sure. So our kids went remote, and so I'm Josh Dunn, and yeah, so I'm speaking both as a researcher and a teacher and scholar here. So, and part of, I think, my interest in joining Dick on this progress was just our own experience, and more than anything, just talking with our own friends who have children. And I would say that our experience kind of matched what we found in the survey, that we generally were fairly pleased with how our children's school responded. That doesn't mean that it was perfect by any means, but it was workable. But then in talking with other parents, there was frustration. It seemed to be that it varied from school to school, and it didn't necessarily depend on the type of school. It could be the same kinds of schools, charter schools, traditional public schools. So I think that kind of drove my interest in this project. This semester, it has been a little more difficult, I think, with just some of the uncertainty. We've had some of our kids get quarantined, and so, but now all but one are at home. But it's still, I do have to applaud the response of our children's teachers and the administrators at their school for doing such a good job in the face of something that no one really could have ever expected.
Any other comments on that before I move on? So I want to shift now to a little bit of a discussion about virtual schooling. And Dr. Carpenter, that was very helpful, the way that you distinguished between homeschooling and virtual schooling. Shane, you have experience with virtual schooling. If you could talk to us a little bit of that, and you've seen an enormous increase in students attending virtual school. So what's that been like, and what have you heard from parents of your students in virtual school?
We've had a pretty good increase in our program. Just to go back to the parent component though, I have a 26-year-old and a 21-year-old. So, obviously both my kids were attending college at the time, and it was definitely a much easier transition for them. But I have to tell you, a lot of parents that I talked to in the spring and worked with, there was a lot of anxiety and concern, and I think a lot of parents just wanted legitimate options for their kids, regardless of if it was in the traditional environment or alternative options, things like that. So very proud of our school district, along with all of our neighboring school districts. We spent the entire summer networking with all the school districts in the Colorado Springs region to just come up with those options. And one of the options that we came up with, where we saw considerable growth, was our D3 My Way asynchronous online program. And our program last year, our enrollment ranged from 90 to 99 students, around that number. And this year it jumped at the start of the year up to 1,400 students. We have about 9,100 students in our district, so it's roughly 15% of our overall population. We did have some students who at quarter had the opportunity at the elementary level to go back to their buildings. So I think right now we're right around 1,200 students. I will say we just conducted a survey of those 1,200 students and their parents, and 90% of those parents still want their child to return for second semester. So we're going to have a considerable amount of those kids coming back second semester. And I agree with Dr. Carpenter's findings, and the fact that majority of parents, their primary concern, because we did ask this question when we enrolled those students, was the safety of their child. I think what is encouraging parents is that a lot of our traditional schools are providing hybrid synchronous models. They're really putting a focus on making sure students are maintaining social distancing, wearing masks, using good hygiene by washing their hands frequently, and doing a lot of things just to be proactive to keep kids safe. And that's encouraging for a lot of parents. But we definitely still have a lot of parents who still are not only preferring our model, but actually have appreciated our model so much that in our survey, we asked how many parents would want their child to come back the following year, potentially post-COVID. Not saying that that's going to be it's going to be over with by then. That'd be optimistic to think that it would be, but around 68% of those parents have expressed an interest in even bring those kids back next year for that. I think a lot of students at the elementary level, if they have the appropriate support and learning coaches at home to help them to be successful, we've seen a lot of success in those areas. On the other end, we've had some parents who've just expressed extreme frustration, and I think Ellen maybe touched on this a little bit. Sometimes it's a little overwhelming at times to, especially have multiple children in the home at multiple grade levels, especially the younger ones, where you have to kind of be there to support them a little bit more. It can be a little bit overwhelming for some of those parents. But overall, I think for the parents that are in the program and that are staying in the program, they're pleased with the option that we're providing them right now in the midst of the pandemic, and they just appreciate the fact that they can continue to provide their child with an education during the pandemic.
So Shane, a question. How many of your 1,400, I guess it's now 1,200, how many of those are from out of district, or do you limit it only to those in district?
We are a primary in-district program. So we do not have any boundary waiver. I would say very minimal amount, if we have any amount of boundary waiver students in our program. So what we did this year, so the way our program is structured is, and obviously we're looking at potentially changing this and transitioning to becoming a school next year to accommodate the increased numbers. But really what happens in our district is our students access their curriculum through our program, but they're still connected to their home school in our program. So there's still a direct connection to that home school. And we wanted to do that so we could provide students with an easy transition back into their home school, potentially once we get through this.
I see. So it's not as though parents from outside of the district knew of your school and then tried to get in.
Correct. But we have seen an increase in the number of online options, independent online schools that are popping up around us to try to kind of attract some of the students who are looking at this option throughout the Colorado Springs region.
Gotcha. Sorry, Dean Conley.
No. I think that was a perfect cue up. When back in March, we started throwing these terms around: remote, synchronous, asynchronous. I think it might be helpful for some of our audience members for you to, if you would, Shane, describe how you use those terms in your virtual school in the district.
Sure. So I'll speak about D3 My Way first. D3 My Way is an asynchronous option. And so what that means is the curriculum is provided through module work. And so it's students are very independent within our structure. So students, it's almost like a guided system where students kind of get cued from the teacher each week of what they should be working on through the week in their module work. And then obviously the teacher does virtual check-ins to provide support and some modeling and some guided practice and various things like that to support their instruction. But I will say the teacher's more of a facilitator within the asynchronous model. Some students excel in that, especially if they have at the elementary level appropriate learning coaches, or they just have that internal motivation at the secondary level to kind of get in there and do that coursework. It's much more personalized. So a lot of motivated students appreciate it because they can work at their own pace and kind of guide themselves through that curriculum. And obviously the teachers are there to facilitate the process throughout the way. But it does not work for everybody. And that's why our district and many other districts also went to a synchronous model, which is fully virtual. But those students, for example, I oversee Discovery High School too. And at Discovery High School, our students walk through their normal schedule every single day and attend their classes virtually with that teacher. So that teacher provides core instruction just as if they would in the traditional environment. They just transferred everything into the virtual world. So that's the synchronous option. There's also the hybrid synchronous model where students are in the building for a couple days. And there are students online and students in person. And the reason for that model is so that they can reduce the number of kids in the building to promote that higher level of social distancing in the classroom. And then after 2 days, those students will go home. The other students will come in, and they will just continue to alternate through that model. And again, the purpose is to provide that face-to-face option while at the same time making sure that we're adhering to all the guidelines that have been given to us by the health department.
Thanks for that, Shane. Ellen, I do just want to give you an opportunity in your professional role also as Director of First Year Experience and Parent Programs. Shane mentioned he has 2 students that are adults. And so, are there parent perceptions that you have observed in your professional role you'd like to share with the group?
Sorry, I had to find my unmute button. So yeah, I hear a lot of the same things from both the students and the parents. And I think the perspective that I think is important for people to understand is the students that I'm typically meeting with are students who are struggling. And so I'm hearing from those parents as well as the students. And we are hearing, kind of similar to my experience with my kindergartner, is that the asynchronous learning typically isn't what's working the best for students who just aren't remote learners, who didn't choose that path. And we can definitely see a big difference already in our data between online, which that would be students who chose to do online. They would have chosen it whether it was an option this semester or not, versus remote. And our students are struggling with that remote piece, but it seems like it's even more challenging in that asynchronous, where they're not meeting with, again, other students. They feel very disconnected from their professors. And we're hearing that a lot from the parents too. And parents sometimes feeling like they're not getting the biggest bang for their money with that asynchronous learning, and trying to really work with them on how we can help their student organize better around that. Because I think it works from both sides of helping the student to organize into that and to kind of adjust a little bit, because the material is there. It's just sometimes there's multiple platforms that they have to learn, and it can feel really overwhelming while they're also feeling the stress from the pandemic as well. So we're seeing it at the college level too, but it definitely seeing it in the remote environment as it's being a challenge, and that if it, again, wasn't for safety, people would probably be choosing in person and wanting it to go back to normal, is what I hear very regularly in my role.
So that makes me think about something that Megan shared in our conversation prior to the town hall. Is, Megan, in your school, there's been face-to-face learning, and you indicated there have been some silver linings to this. What changes have been made that you think will outlast COVID?
Mm-hmm. Sure, thank you. And actually, since that meeting, my list has continued to grow, right? As I walked through school in days following, I started to see even more things, and my list is too long to share, to go through it item by item. But really, I would start by saying that, at the end of our school year, in the spring, we hosted a whole staff Zoom, and we asked all of our staff members to share out the positives that they could pull from this. Because while we could have sat and talked about, how horrible everything was, we found it was really important to point out the learning that happened for staff as well as students throughout this process. And so for almost 45 minutes, we had staff sharing out, just repeated one after another, of all of these huge benefits. And it turned into a nearly 8-page document listing all of these pulls for us to make sure that we embedded in the hopes of coming back in person this fall, which thankfully we've been able to do. And so really we've had 3 big umbrellas, if you will, of areas that have been silver linings for us. And the first is instruction. Really looking at the impact of having that one-to-one access to technology and the impact that has had on a blending learning opportunity for our teachers and for our kids and for parents as well. And so our staff had to very quickly become experts in all things virtual and having a format for instruction that everyone could access pretty easily. And they found ways to be able to host small groups through having pre-created videos that kids could access. And so really the dream that every teacher thinks and says aloud of, I wish I could split myself throughout the day and reach all these kids, now can actually happen. And so they're continuing to do that to this day, where they're recording lessons. They have kids that take their devices out and they're in a small group with teacher virtually watching a lesson and a video that has activities for them to access while teacher is live and working with another group of kids. We also were able to really embed an online platform that parents can access, and our teachers load all of their lessons and videos and access to activities on this platform to this day. And so parents can go on, they can see lessons. And so those questions of, I don't know what learning looks like in class, are now gone because it's out there. And so really that veil has kind of been lifted, and parents are able to see what their kids are having access to on a regular basis. Our kids' skills and technology have grown exponentially. And, that's really been a huge win for us. There was a lot of fear, I think, at the front end, especially with our littles, our kinders and first graders, that, this will be too hard for them. And well, that was crazy, because we all know in this field, if we set an expectation for kids, they will reach it and go beyond. So they have become little experts in all things tech, and that continues to grow and push our teachers to continue to grow as well. I think the second umbrella is communication. This really forced some increased communication between teachers and parents. And, I think for some teachers, there's always that fear of reaching out, right? A phone call is scary, or reaching out to parents for whatever reason just has this like fear attached to it. And that's gone. We had to get over that really quickly, because we had to be in touch with families. We had to do check-ins. Families that maybe we didn't hear from in a while in the spring. We wanted them to know that we were looking for them and we were concerned for them and wanted to help. And so our teachers played a vital role in that. And so now a lot of that is gone, and that has continued as we've come back to being in person. And we have apps that make things pretty accessible, probably to the point where, for those of you who are parents on the panel, you get so many alerts in a day that you probably stop looking after a while. So we've tried to coach through, when we should be communicating and when you might want to make your list and send one, so we're not overwhelming parents. Our social media blew up. And so we, in the spring, had virtual theme days and virtual competitions, and did videos and had our kids say the pledge and our school motto online to try to keep some consistency with what we had done. And so that's continued, because we obviously can't have a slew of kids come into the front office for pledge and motto every day. So our kids have all done flip grids on their computers, and I pull one up every day, and that's how we do our pledge and motto for everybody. And then I think, as we look into things we can pull into our in-person, the third big one for us has just been building practices, right? And having more structure in the hallways. Hand washing, who knew that we had so many people that weren't washing their hands, which is frightening. But we have a full-time school nurse in every one of our buildings now, which is a huge win for us, and has also built some relationship with families to know they have someone they can call and talk to. But also she's given lessons on hand washing. We have hand washing stations all over our building. Our kids have gotten so much better at making sure when they leave the bathroom, I'm not having to stand out there and ask to wash your hands. They know the importance. They encourage one another to make sure they're being safe. And they're great at practicing engaging activities in the classroom, but still trying to maintain some distance. And so I think a lot of our fears of coming back to in-person and thinking our kids would struggle, we were so wrong. Our kids have done amazingly well. And like I said, my list is huge, but those are three big win areas.
So Megan, a couple of questions for you, and I think Shane could weigh in on some of these as well. The first is, to what extent did you have to provide technology to families in the spring? And I ask that because in our survey, one of the questions we asked of parents was, do you have, or to what degree did you have technology? Mm-hmm. And was that provided by the school or did you already have it? And then we asked them about the internet access that they had. And again, is that something that the school provided? And we found that taking those in reverse order, the access to the internet was pretty much 100%, and that most everybody was paying for their own internet. But as far as technology goes, a lot of parents, I would say greater than 90% of parents, said they had technology, but a large percentage of, I shouldn't say large in the sense it's a majority, but more than we expected, said that their schools provided a device for them. So what was your experience in that in the spring?
Yeah, so our district did offer devices to any family in need to be able to come and pick up a device. And in some cases we delivered if parents weren't able to transport. So I was pretty regularly grabbing a computer and delivering to a home and ringing the doorbell and stepping away, letting them know their device was there. But in talking to our district technology department, really those first 2 to 4 weeks were crazy. We were all trying to figure out what this would look like, and our families were trying to figure it out. And so I think that's where the bulk of frustration was. And so they reported they had between 150 and 200 tech support situations a day in those first 2 to 4 weeks until things really calmed down. But we did offer devices to anybody. Like I said, hotspots weren't an option until a little bit later in the spring. But even then, we didn't have a whole lot of families that reached out to say they needed a hotspot. And even currently, we only have about 100 that are checked out across our district. So I think maybe more rural districts have been a little more impacted by that lack of internet than we have been in a more urban setting. But really, our tech department has been wonderful in being accessible for families to call, to come in. We did trade-offs at the building. So if families had a problem with their device, they would just come and trade it out with us, and we try to troubleshoot with them. And so I think that was the bulk of our issue in the beginning, of just everyone troubleshooting to figure out how to make this work, how to get online, which login to use, all of those things that now we're pros at, but those first few weeks were a big struggle.
Mm-hmm. Shane, how about you? Did your district have to distribute a lot of technology?
I would say we're very similar to what Megan shared. We're a neighboring school district, so a very similar experience. We did have a number of students, but it's very limited in the spring that required technology, and so we provided it on an as needed basis. I will say our technology department, they've worked very, very hard, especially over the summer, ordering, procuring a lot of new technology for our district. And we actually have at this point an initiative where we want to really get technology in the hands of every single one of our students, regardless if they have it at home or not. We want to make sure we're providing that resource to all of our students. And then I would also say that many of our students did have that internet access, and so I think it's very minimal, but we have provided a number of hotspots to our students who have needed them as we went through this process.
So my second related question is, Megan, you talked about how the technology that you were basically forced to integrate or use in the spring, you're now just kind of seamlessly integrating that into the classroom in the fall. So the question is, did you already have a lot of this technology and weren't using it, and then it was forced on you? Do you understand my question?
Yes. No, we did not have the technology. We were at about a 3-to-1, 3 students to every device across our building prior to this. We are now a 1-to-1 district across all of our buildings. And so every single student has a device every single day. It's theirs. Our littler kids use a QR code and just scan it at their camera when they open their device, and it hops them right onto their homepage with all of the icons of any site they would need to go to. Teacher pre-created lessons are just at their fingertips, as well as some practice activities for them to be able to access, and their curriculum websites. So our older students had a lot more access. and availability to technology than our younger students did. But this has been something that we've been pushing for. And so this was a positive, right, to come from COVID, that now it's happened and that will not go away. And I think the continued growth, again, of our teachers and students in learning how to utilize these devices will just continue. They're no longer a open your device and do a math practice game. We very rarely see that happening. We have kids doing integrated projects, sharing through Google Slides and creating research together and presentations together, recording themselves and posting it, and then they're providing feedback to one another. So this really is an opportunity for them to grow skills that they will later need for the workforce.
Shane, how about you?
I just want to first give a shout out to all of our teachers, because it's just been amazing to see the growth from the spring to where we're at now. Many of them spent their entire summers sitting through professional development and classes just guided and designed to help them provide quality instruction in the virtual world. And the growth that I've seen is amazing. I walked through my building the other day and just went from classroom to classroom and watched everything that we're doing we're in distance learning right now, but everything that we're doing to support our students in the virtual world, and how teachers can connect and give feedback to individual students at any time via Google Docs or slides or, Pear Deck or any of these other virtual tools that they're using. And I just have to say, I always try to take negatives and turn them into a positive. And I truly think that as the D3 My Way, the person who oversees D3 My Way and a huge proponent of blended learning and really trying to personalize learning and meet kids where they're at, I think with a lot of our teachers having a skill set now that maybe they didn't have before, it's going to give them confidence to have a rotational model in their classroom where they can meet kids where they're at and strategically group kids and have small groups and have some virtual activities going on in one section of the room where they're meeting with some other students who need some guided support in the other side of the room, or a flipped classroom model maybe at the secondary level where teachers can spend class time actually having kids apply the coursework, and that way kids at home can spend more time going through the lectures and things like that sometimes tend to take up a majority of the class time. And I really think that would just allow teachers to provide more quality descriptive feedback during class, which ultimately is going to help them improve their performance. So I see a lot of positives coming out of this. We definitely have some students struggling. And I think a big thing though is we've got to get kids to engage. And that's our difficulty right now, is some students, depending on where they're at social emotionally, what type of support systems they have at home. There's so many variables that go into it, but everything is there in place for them. If we can just continue to try to find ways to get them to engage, rather than their principal calling 5 times a day trying to figure out what's going on.
So Josh, your children are older. Ellen's child is in first grade, but Josh, your kids are older. From the parent and particularly from the student perspective, what we're hearing is that the technology is being integrated more and that it seems to be positive. Has that been the perspective from your children, from the student side?
So it depends on the child. I have one child who the transition to remote learning was very easy. Interestingly, she's our youngest. She's in 5th grade. So you'd expect her to actually need more assistance, but she really didn't. It was just her nature. And so she was fine, but she's also the one who's most social and sort of missed the social interaction the most at school. And so for her, it was fine. For our other kids, it was mixed. Some of it has gone well. I think it might change the trajectory of a couple of our kids in high school. They might switch to something that's more online, that they've acclimated to it. And so again, I can't speak with full confidence about it, but I do think that for some kids it's worked fairly well. With other kids, it's been a bit of a struggle, but that I do give credit to particularly our kids' teachers, for making the process work as well as possible for them. I think that the teachers understand that some of the students, this switch has been easier than for others, and they try to meet the kids where they are in that process. So that's kind of been our experience. I will say, one of our kids who probably should be in person more was delighted when she was quarantined. So it's just that kind. Yeah, that's just her disposition. So it's just it's and it requires more on our part too, just kind of figuring out, hey, are you actually spending the time that you need to, that you're getting what you need. I think the teachers did adapt pretty quickly. Particularly, you can see a big difference from spring to this fall, even though some of this disruptions in the fall have been a little bit difficult to navigate. That really there was just a ton of progress made between the spring and the fall. There's a lot of work put in. Teachers are obviously recording lectures for kids who couldn't be there, that then they would have access to them. So all of that has been pretty impressive.
So let's shift the discussion a little bit to talking about social emotional needs of children and how social emotional needs are being impacted in the remote learning environment. There was a lot of attention starting to be placed on social emotional learning before COVID hit. The legislature was actually taking up a bill that would look at requiring ed prep programs to include some attention in their prep programs to this. And during our prep call for this town hall, Ellen, you shared an interesting perspective on this. Would you mind sharing and describing that experience a little bit?
Sure. So I think, I kind of alluded to the fact that we struggled a lot with the unstructured nature. It felt like in the at least the kindergarten version of all of this, and the initial version. And I have to say, at the same time, I was also 9 months pregnant, having another baby. So my daughter was also dealing with becoming a big sister at that point as well. But we were starting to see our daughter, who used to be a really good listener and who would help us with anything and is just very loving. All of a sudden we get into the learning, and we were fighting every day, just trying to get her to do her work, and she wasn't listening. And I didn't know if it was developmental or not, because I have her as my first grader. I'm used to college students. And so we were really, really struggling with that. And we eventually, because we felt like it was just a constant battle, and we did hear that the grading wasn't really going to matter. I confirmed that with her teacher. We decided to actually step back from the class a little bit and just try to find ways to make school or learning not feel like school or anymore, because it was just constant battles. So I started doing more of the life skills stuff of, let's sort the laundry and working on our colors and if we have 10 articles of clothing, but only 3 of them end up in the washing machine, how many of them are still dirty, kind of, doing math and that sort of stuff, or cooking and measuring things, and kind of starting that. She was starting to really read recipes and stuff as well. So I think that really helped. And that's part of the reason for us that we chose to go in person is while we were really nervous, I was really nervous about going back to in person because of the health risks. The social emotional, just seeing my daughter kind of get depressed and she was not herself. Her behavior, it was really rough. I didn't know who this kid was, and we were trying to give her all that we could, but it was really hard. But as soon as we did go back to in person, her behavior completely shifted. And I think has a lot to do with her first grade teacher. I do think that they spent a lot of time with students, the kids getting to know one another and talking with one another. And I think I shared this actually before the meeting tonight, but even an example today is they were supposed to have specials, and for some reason their specials teacher wasn't there. And all of a sudden all these kids are playing Simon Says and having a dance party. And I thought that's really cool that they filled that time with time with one another, just playing a game and spending that time. And I think that goes a lot to everything that everyone is saying, with the time that they've spent with teachers, kind of helping them to embrace this new environment. And so I think that has helped so much with that we didn't have in the spring that we have now. And so even though we're in this e-learning, it doesn't feel like we're losing anything right now.
And we have heard quite a bit about learning loss, and Dr. Carpenter, you referenced that in your opening remarks as well, the concern about the slip that may happen, and that researchers will be studying this for quite some time. We do know, though, that some students are actually excelling in these different environments. And so I'd just like to open it up and see if anyone would like to comment specifically on the topic of learning loss.
I'll say a little bit about it, both from a personal experience with our children, and then just some of the research that really has just come out in the past couple of days. So I don't think there's any doubt that there's learning loss that's happened. We saw that with our children, particularly saw it with math classes. That's where they started the fall semester, and I think the teachers were trying to figure out where the students were, and it was pretty clear that some things that they thought that, or were hoping that they had actually mastered after everyone went remote in the spring, that they really hadn't. And so they had to kind of go through a bit of a review stage. And I think that in the end, that'll probably be fine for our kids. And I think for a lot of kids, that's going to be fine. But there's no doubt that for many students, there has been learning loss. My biggest worry is that we're likely to see learning loss among traditionally disadvantaged students, and it's going to be even more difficult for them to make up that loss. There was an article in the Washington Post just today or yesterday called "The Lost Generation," and that goes over some of the research that's just come out. There's a McKinsey report kind of documenting now. We actually have real data showing the learning loss that's occurred, and it's what you would have expected, that among traditionally disadvantaged students, that's where it's been the greatest. And so you're going to have widening achievement gaps there. And since we weren't very good at closing those achievement gaps to begin with, this is going to be a long-term problem that's going to persist, I think, for several years. For a lot of kids, it will be fine. But I don't think we can turn away from the fact that for some of these kids, this is going to be a serious educational deficit, and we got to try and figure out as a society how to bring them back up.
So Megan, we were talking, I think, last week about the steps that you had taken, or your kindergarten teachers had taken, I think, if I remember correctly, on the social emotional front. Do I remember that correctly?
Yes, you do. Very well done. And actually, as a building, and I would say even as a district, we pushed at the front end of this year for a delayed start to the academic piece, so we could really check in on our kids and make sure that social emotional component was met. Kinder took it further, and so we did not begin academics in kindergarten until mid to late October. They were doing a lot of purposeful play stations that did embed some academic elements, but that full instruction was really more dedicated to, building self-management and self-awareness and relationship skills and decision-making, all those components that make for successful learners, but digging into the social emotional side to be able to build those executive functioning skills that would then help to access academics. And, I actually was talking with my assistant principal today about that, and we both were, watching a student process a situation earlier, and just said, this wouldn't have happened in years past, to watch our kids be able to independently have their needs met in kindergarten, instead of having a meltdown or a tantrum, and then we get called to the room to help. And it's been so, inspiring really to see what could come from this as another silver lining of us really devoting time to that social emotional element. And not to say that academics aren't important, because they absolutely are. But if we don't deal with that social emotional piece, then our kids aren't going to achieve what they could academically. And I think as we continue to see that throughout these next few years, that's an interesting thing for me. And in looking at my current studies and research in social emotional learning, to have this right under my nose to watch and see even more so what our kids are capable of achieving.
So Dr. Dunn mentioned that students coming back in the fall were behind academically. Was there something noticeable in social emotional learning with students coming back in the fall?
Yes, very much, especially for our students that were only children who were home and who were pretty removed from kids for a pretty extensive amount of time. Just those simple things like sharing and turn taking and not getting your way right away was leading to some pretty significant reactions. Not knowing how to speak up for themselves or have a typical conversation was a struggle. We saw some regression in some of our students who had struggled in years past, but I'm happy to say they are all back on a very successful track in making sure that piece is met for them.
Shane, we often think of social emotional learning with younger students. Is this something that you've all talked about with older students?
We actually developed we developed a couple things to really try to focus in and hone in on that. I'm a firm believer with our students, relationships are everything. If you don't have that relationships piece with students, it's going to be very challenging to engage and encourage them to do anything for you. So we met as a team prior to the year and identified some ways that we could try to connect with kids a little bit deeper than just a normal classroom teacher might be able to. And so we had always had kind of a mentor program, but we created a very strategic mentor program where teachers were not only connecting with the kids, they connect with our kids every single week, but they're there obviously anytime for one-on-one conferences if students are struggling. They do a weekly screener or bi-weekly screener, depending on the age level, that goes out to all of the students. Students identify who their adult is that they're comfortable, connecting with, their issue that's going on. And we really want to make sure those kids are getting connected if they have some struggles going on. So between our mentor program and our screener, I think that's really helped us kind of stay as connected as we can in the virtual world. But even at the elementary level, I have to tell you the coolest thing that I've seen for our little ones are our teachers put together a thing called Lunch Bunch. And they are meeting with their kinder kids, their first grade kids, and you should hear these conversations. But these kids are just hopping on at lunchtime just so they can connect and have social conversations with their classmates. The teacher obviously is there as a facilitator, ensures stay as focused as they can at that level. But the kids are really excited to get on there and talk to their classmates and engage with their classmates virtually. So just some things that that I've seen that we've tried to do to make sure we're supporting our kids at the emotional level.
So Dr. Dunn, again, your kids are older, and I think we all know that, as Shane just mentioned, for teenagers, relationships are really important. Have you noticed this to be a struggle in remote learning for your older kids?
Not so much for our kids, because it turns out that their friends tend to be centered around their athletic activities. And so they were still able to do some of that. Things were shut down for a while, but over the summer, and particularly baseball, my two oldest are boys and they're baseball players. So both of them were able to play baseball this summer, and that made a huge difference in their lives. And then this fall, they also were able to play and to practice. So for them, that's what they needed. It also helps that they have very close friends just in our neighborhood. So it's, they're always at their friend's house, or they're always here. So it really wasn't a really a big issue for us. And we were quite grateful for that. If they had not had that outlet, then it would have been a problem. But overall, it worked out as well as you could hope for.
So our researchers often are engaged with policymakers, and I have started to see some of the questions coming in over the chat. And so I think we're going to, in the interest of time, start addressing some of those questions that are coming in from our audience participants. And this first one is really sort of a connection to the policy environment. And it's about how we might leverage what's happening right now in a positive way, given how strongly parents are valuing our teachers and our schools. How might we maximize this positive feeling to encourage fully funding education, paying our teachers higher salaries that they deserve, making sure we have adequate school counselors, school nurses, you mentioned, Megan, in all of our schools? Is there something that we can do to try to leverage the positive feelings towards education right now in the policy world?
Josh, do you want to try that first?
Yeah, I'll just say that if I were actually good at figuring out what you could do to make change in the policy world, I'd probably be doing something else and being well compensated for it. So I'm not certain exactly how you do that. I do think that it will vary from place to place. I think in some places you're going to see after this year, perhaps parents being dissatisfied. I don't think that we're going to see that to a large degree here in Colorado, and particularly in El Paso County. I don't think that we'll see that. But I do think there's going to be a real range of opinions on this after this year, because our research focused on what happened last spring, and we're going to have a whole nother year of this, and there are going to be some places around the country where schools will be they have been closed since last March all the way through this coming this entire academic year, and I think there's going to be a lot of frustration there. So in places like that, I think you get the political climate is going to actually be worse. But here in Colorado, I think that you see the work that's been done in our school districts. I think that provides an opportunity for the school districts to go out and make the case to the public. But this is Colorado, right? And so anytime you want to increase funding, the voters do have to approve it, and we know that's just always a tough sell. So I don't know that that I have any kind of magic advice about how to translate the current feelings into policy changes. Although I could say a little bit about litigation, because I think there will be litigation that will happen, but I'm not certain that could at least on this front there would actually be possible to use litigation to address that concern.
I would add that some of the things that Megan talked about, and some that Shane talked about as well, the silver linings that Megan was talking about before, those types of experiences and anecdotes and stories can go a long way in helping influence policymakers. As painful as it is for me to admit, the data that I produce and the research that I produce aren't nearly as persuasive as really great anecdotes. And so the types of experiences that Megan and Shane describe, the good things that are happening in their classrooms, those things could be, I don't want to say exploited because that sounds too pejorative, but could be used in a positive way in order to help people understand the good things that have happened in classrooms. And to that, I would also add, one of my concerns in hearing Megan and Shane describe what's been going on in schools is the extent to which those things can be sustained. I think anyone who has worked in education for any number of years recognizes that technology can be very powerful, and it also has a cost associated with it, a maintenance cost and a sustainability cost that people often don't think about or don't realize. And so my concern is to the extent to which this technology is being integrated into classrooms, that's great, but how are we going to sustain this past COVID? And I'm of the opinion that there will be some post-COVID period in our lives, but the question is, how are we going to sustain it once COVID is over and continue to use these and have schools continue to have the resources necessary in order to make that happen?
I'd like to just speak to that a little bit. I mean, as a district leader, we want to be innovative and we want to, do everything we can to make sure we're providing the best possible instruction for our students, but we have to have the teachers to do that. And I have to advocate for our teachers a little bit. They are working very hard. They are basically taking everything they normally would utilize to teach in the traditional environment and transferring all that into the virtual world. That takes a lot of time. That takes a lot of effort to do that. And it also takes a unique skill set. So we already prior to this had teacher shortages and things like that that we were dealing with just because of how challenging the field of education has become. And I would just argue that there has to come a point where people across our state recognize that we're here to do what's best for kids. We want to make sure we're providing the best education possible. We want to recruit high-skilled teachers, but with the time and effort that goes into providing quality instruction, we have to be able to compensate that. So just wanted to make sure I'm taking the time to kind of advocate for our educators out there that are working not only hard now, but it's, from where education is at now to compared to when I started. Obviously, things have changed. How students learn have changed, and it takes a unique skill set to be able to meet the kids where they're at. And so hopefully we'll keep having this conversation, and some change will come down the road.
So there was another question in the chat about specifically how have the principals supported staff with COVID-19 stress and fatigue?
Sure. It's so hard to know if we're meeting that and doing that well. I know for us in our building and even across the district, it's really about communication, and doing check-ins. And so my assistant principal and I walk the building every day to greet, we check in, we can read some affects and know if there are some people we might need to check in with a little bit more. We've removed things from plates, former requirements, previous requirements. We've tried to take something away because there have been, like Shane mentioned, so many new things added onto their plates. So we've tried to make some room there. We do little treats throughout the week and stop in to give a snack or a little gift or a check-in or a note, a positive note for them. And really too, I think for us, it's been important to acknowledge that every day isn't great. There are some very hard days, and to ignore that and not honor the fact that there are struggles, I think is a disservice. I know I've read about this toxic positivity, right? Of we're just going to smile and pretend that everything's okay, and it eventually will be. And that doesn't work. So while we are maintaining as much positivity as we can, we've also tried to be realistic and have some real conversations with teachers and say, it's okay that you've had a rough day today. We have another go, and let us know what we can do to support and to step in and provide that in classrooms as it's needed. But I know that's something my assistant principal and I work every day to be better at and to really watch to see, are we missing something? Is there something more that people might need? We've tried to embed some fun. I've given jeans days every day this year. They can wear them whenever they want. So I know that's a huge deal in a lot of schools, and it might seem little to most people, but to teachers, that's a big win to get to have that. And just those types of little things of we see you and we honor the work that you're doing without missing, and walking right past a struggle that might be happening.
I think the only thing that I would add to that, because that's 100%, Megan is right on there. Everything that she mentioned, we are definitely, as administrators, trying to be there and advocate and support. I would just say that one thing I think has helped in my buildings is just providing that voice and allowing teachers to be part of the solution. And just, that way everything isn't top down and it's actually more of a team approach where we're coming together, and it's been pretty amazing just creating those collaborative teams and hearing the ideas and things that teachers are coming up with to solve some of these problems that we're going through right now. And I think when they're, like I said, part of that solution, part of that process, that helps with the morale a little bit.
So, sorry. So to what extent, we heard a little bit about this over the summer, where there was discussion about a large number of teachers perhaps just leaving the profession because the work was just overwhelming. To what extent have you seen, Megan and Shane, to what extent did you see that in the summer and into the fall in your districts?
So we did not, we weren't impacted by that, so to speak. What did impact us was needing to pull a lot of our intervention positions. I lost a dean, which makes my world a little bit harder. So that was my personal take on that one. But we lost a lot of those positions that, in the past were our ways to provide support, because we had to make more classes. So we would have smaller class sizes to honor some distancing and some of those regulations that were coming forward. And so for that, if I had a teacher that was like, I was on a path to be an administrator as a dean, I'm not looking to go back into the classroom. They looked elsewhere. So we lost some people due to that, where they maybe picked up an admin position in another district instead of staying to be in a classroom in ours. But no one that left as a result of the tough situation that we had towards the end of the school year.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to get that question in there for the principals on the panel, since it came through the chat. I want to now make sure we circle back around to our topic focusing on parents' perceptions. And this question is for our researchers. There is a question about whether there was anything in the survey or a portion of your study that assessed parents' emotional well-being. We've talked about the students' social emotional needs. What about parents' social emotional needs? And the participant noted that once parents accepted the chaos of the current situation, they seem to do better in working with their children during virtual learning. These are parents that I know personally, so no formal research, but based on some of the social psychology reading that I've been doing, it has been brought up that it's an interesting perspective with regard to anxiety and resilience. So did you have anything in the study that tried to get at how parents were feeling in terms of their level of anxiety or their social emotional wellness?
We didn't. The closest that we came was to ask them how prepared they felt. And I addressed those results earlier. That was about the closest that we came. It's something that we had thought about including, but the longer your survey gets, the less your response rate is going to be. So we kind of had to pick and choose and prioritize what types of questions we would include. So that was about the closest question that we had on that. I would like to bring up a topic, however, if we have a moment, and that is the issue of students with special needs. One of the questions on our survey did ask specifically, does your child have a special need? And those who said yes, we asked them, did they continue to receive services during the COVID period? And so I was pleasantly surprised to find that a large majority of the parents reported they continued, their special needs child continued to receive services during the spring COVID period. So Megan and or Shane, was that your experience as well, that you were able to provide services for those who had IEPs or special needs?
Yeah, our district really made a concerted effort to do everything they could to support our special education students. In fact, I'll be honest with you, at the secondary level, when a majority of the students were on distance learning, a lot of our students in our life skills program, our WISP program, things like that, still came into the building. We were obviously able to social distance them a lot more, but for a lot of our special education students, we were able to bring them in and provide those one-on-one services. I would say in some staffing meetings though, especially with asynchronous learning, it's just not the best fit for students. And so we would try to kind of speak to parents and encourage them to look at some other options, just because some of the supports cannot be provided in that. And some parents were willing to kind of work around some of those supports and still encourage their kids to engage in the asynchronous model. And you know, our teachers have done a phenomenal job of doing as much as they can to make sure that those accommodations and modifications are adhered to as much as possible.
And we've had a similar situation as Shane has. So we jumped in right away in the spring with our special education providers, reaching out to families, setting up individual Zoom meetings to work with kids, trying to do some small groups when you're working on social and behavior skills is really interesting through Zoom. But they did it and plugged those pieces in. And as we've moved into the school year, we do have quite a few students in our virtual academy that are on IEPs and have special supports. And so that's continued. Our school-based special education providers are still providing that support even for students who are in BA. We did the same. We really tried to encourage coming in, being a part of in-person learning, but you know, there are health needs, there are other situations in homes that just doesn't allow for that to happen. And so we've set meetings and have met with families multiple times to make sure that we're setting up instruction and instructional time that works best to meet the needs of their student.
Hey, I think I'm going to pose the final question, which has come through on the chat. And I think it's one that each one of our panelists might be able to offer some response to. And that is, what may be the top 3 strategies to assure success during virtual learning, specifically for parents to use with their children at home and for students themselves? And how did educators and parents balance the use of devices and off-screen time in that environment?
Ellen, why don't you jump in on that first, and we can kind of start with the parent's perspective and then kind of go to Megan and then Shane.
Yeah, I think that's a big question. I think that for our family, and I'm going more to the screen time and the devices, we've had to give ourselves a little bit of grace that there's going to be a little bit more screen time than we normally would like. We've had to be intentional, and we're not always perfect about trying to get outside every day, or at least send her outside to the backyard to play every day, but we walk to the mail, or we actually live close enough to the school that we can walk to the school and play at the playground every day if we want. But so in terms of the screen time piece, I think that's there. I think from a parent's perspective, I think every kid is different. And so it's going to look different for every kid. But the structure has helped us, and the communication with the teachers has helped us, because I found that I am not always the most forgiving of myself, but as soon as I talk to my daughter's teacher and we have a plan, it makes it easier for me, and it also makes it easier for me to organize with my daughter to say, oh, I don't have to be in at exactly this time when I don't have other care for my youngest and all these things. And so I think that communication is really the strategy, and just adding grace to that on all levels, being graceful with your children, being graceful with the teacher, and giving grace to yourself, because I try to do everything perfect, and I have learned that does not work at all during COVID. But I also feel that there has been extra screen time in our family, and I'm okay with that. I'm careful with what screen time it is, but we have had to set even more time for her to connect with her friends socially. So she's on the screen more because she's doing Teams meetings with her best friend so that she can have that social time still while we're isolating or whatever.
So I have probably more than three, but I'll just cover kind of three that I think are really important. And I think one thing is, the first thing is making sure that students that are in virtual learning or online learning or distance learning or whatever have a disruption-free learning environment. Making sure that they have a location where, you know, especially if there's multiple kids on conferences in the same house at the same time, or there's things going on, making sure kids have a really good learning environment where they can engage. The next thing is for asynchronous, developing a schedule that works for your child. That is huge. And then making sure your child sticks to that schedule is also very important. So if there's virtual sessions they need to attend, make sure they're attending those sessions. It's as I mentioned earlier, I really feel like our teachers have done a phenomenal job of embedding the core practices into their instruction in the virtual world. It's just a matter sometimes of getting the kids there on time or getting them there at all to take all that in. And so as you know, parents, just making sure that your child is sticking to that schedule and that they are attending, I think is vital. And lastly, exactly what Ellen said, on the administrator side of things, that open communication between the teacher and the parent is crucial. In the classroom, the teacher can observe, the teacher can see if the student is struggling. They know if the child is having a bad day. Sometimes there's a disconnect, obviously, when that child is at home. So if there's things going on or outside factors that are inhibiting that child from learning, the teachers need to know about it. Maybe the administration needs to know about it. And we just have to keep those lines of communication open. So those are kind of three that I thought stood out in my mind.
And I don't have a whole lot different there. And Ellen, as I made myself a list, you were ticking off my list as we went. So I don't know if I have a magic paper that feeds into what you're thinking. But I mean, first thing I wrote down was really trying to establish some consistency, right? And it doesn't have to be perfect, but trying to follow a schedule. And then second, trying to get outside, spend some time outside. And I think we forget that it's okay for kids to be bored. Let them be bored for a little bit. Not every minute needs to be filled with a device, a game, a check-in. Let them develop some creativity on their own. And then schedule some of that time with friends. They need that social interaction outside of parents and siblings. That's how we learn to problem solve. And I wrote right next to my list, grace, just like you were talking about, Ellen, that we're really good at giving it to others and horrible at giving it to ourselves. So this is a world none of us knows. And it continues to evolve and change and get crazy and then get calm. And so as we navigate through, we have to remember to breathe and reflect. And like Shane said, find some positives amidst all of the things that we could focus on being negative.
Josh, did you want to add anything?
I agree with all of that. And it's great advice. Of course, the difficulty is sticking to it. You know, trying to follow it. We do give grace to our kids. Probably we maybe moved too far in that direction. I will say that initially I was very grateful for the first time to have Xboxes in our house because that served as a source of social and emotional learning with their friends. But then they quickly figured out that they could use that to try and convince us to give them more time. Like that was their social outlet. So we maybe went a little bit too far with that, but it was still good. So I was grateful for all of the technology that did allow them to maintain some semblance of a normal, both educational and social life. But for us, the biggest thing has been just trying to make certain the kids stay on a consistent schedule. Again, with some it's easier than others. I mentioned my youngest daughter. She gets up and does her work first thing, and you know, because she knows that once she gets it done, she can do whatever. The others, it's a little tougher.
Yeah, I certainly affirm all of that. I would add just two things. One is based on my own background, and this goes back to something that Dr. Dunn mentioned, and that is the extent to which you can find ways for your children to be involved in activities they like, a sport, music, something that they're involved in these activities that they enjoy. We call them extracurricular or specials, but for many students, and I was one of them, these things become their life, like the central part of their life. And often they're missing that in a significant way because of all of this COVID closure and so forth. So to the extent that you can find ways for them to be involved in the activities that they so value, then so much the better. And then related also to something we were talking about earlier, and this again is something Dr. Dunn was talking about, finding ways for them to be involved with their friends, and not just in pure academic ways, but in unstructured ways as well. Because as we said, those relationships with their friends are so important as they're growing up.
Amazing panelists, amazing conversation, and that's all the time that we have. Thank you all so much for participating. Be well, everyone. Thank you.